In the 1970s, the Springboks thought of themselves as international rugby's powerhouse. The 1974 British Lions tour of South Africa was a rude awakening for the men in green and gold. This is the story of long-haired, headband-wearing, rock-and-rolling hippies teaching South Africa how to play rugby. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. The following story is a condensed version of my book, When the Lions Came to Town, the 1974 rugby tour to South Africa. One of the most foul-mouthed members of the opposition faced by the British Lions on their 1974 rugby tour of South Africa was a parrot called Pitt. At the beginning of their tour, the Lions camped at the Three Fountains Hotel in Stilfontein, gold mining country in what used to be called the Western Transvaal, where Pitt the parrot was a feature of hotel life. Andy Ripley, the England number 8 who deputized for Mervyn Davies throughout the tour, would wander down to the breakfast table in the mornings in his sandals and his cheesecloth shirt, book in hand, an unfocused look in his eyes. Pitt would see him and immediately unleash a torrent of foul-mouthed abuse. Ripley would carry on regardless, because Pitt's swearing was in Afrikaans. Ripley might have sensed that Pitt the parrot was less than friendly, but it didn't matter. Like a throw-in from a line-out that didn't reach its jumper, the words flew right over Ripley's head. They flew over others' heads too. The Afrikaans word for swearing is vloeking. It's a grand word, far better than swearing, which is a word put to multiple use in a variety of forms. Vloeking has something vaguely onomatopoeic about it, a word that is as earthy and jocularly literal as the language from which it springs. So whenever an Afrikaans listener heard Pitt swearing at the Lions in Afrikaans, they would either grin or chuckle or burst out laughing. We don't know what Pitt actually said. History doesn't record that, but we know that he swore like a trooper every time he saw a lion, doing his bit for the Springbok cause and softening them up for the battles ahead. The owners of the Three Fountains Hotel were a couple called Frida and Doop van Heerden. Frida and Doop were worried about the Lions. They even gave an interview to the Rand Daily Mail to voice their concerns. They were worried about the Pride running amok, thrashing their hotel rooms like Led Zeppelin and destroying linen and bed frames, smashing mirrors. They worried about women. They worried about music and general rowdiness. They needn't have bothered. All that would come later. At the beginning of the tour, the Lions were well behaved, almost suspiciously so. Their most expressive act of domestic self-assertion in those early days was to ask the hotel chef to fry their breakfast eggs in butter, not margarine. And yes, they wanted boerewors with their bacon. They liked boerewors very much. Otherwise, they were model tourists. If you didn't mind the full ashtrays, many Lions were smokers, or the puke-stained T-shirts and rugby jerseys that came into the laundry after a morning of demanding training. They also enjoyed their freshly painted rooms and the manicured grass next to the swimming pool. Frida and Doop made sure the swimming pool itself sparkled like a smile. When they weren't puking on the edge of the training field, the Lions were working on their tans and playing a round or two of golf at the local golf club. It was within walking distance of the hotel at the Strathvaal Rugby Club in Stilfontein that the Lions forged their South African bulkhead. After Sid Miller and Willie John McBride, both of them rugged Ulstermen, had been chosen to coach and lead the Lions respectively, astute British rugby observers saw the writing on the wall. The Lions were going to take on the Boks where they were strongest, in the scrum, the seat of the Boks' physical and emotional power, believing that this was where they were best subdued. In order to do that, they needed to, quote, scrum, 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 and scrum again, in Miller's words, and this they did for hours on end, in the relatively relaxed atmosphere of Strathvaal. Shortly before their opening match, a midweek fixture against Western Transvaal, which the Lions won comfortably, the players received their first Lions jersey. Up until that point, the Lions had only nominally been Lions. Mostly they'd been Welshmen or Englishmen, the countries they represented in the annual Five Nations. It's a delicate transition, becoming a Lion, and in this instance it was handled with smarts and delicacy and an appropriate sense of occasion. The most recent tour by the British Lions, they were still called that then, not the British and Irish Lions, before coming to South Africa, had been to New Zealand in 1971. At least half of the players in that victorious 1971 Lions team didn't come to South Africa. John Dawes didn't make the trip, the Welsh lock Delmy Thomas didn't make the trip, and neither did the England skipper John Pullen. John Bevan didn't make the trip either, and neither did David Duckham or the wizard fly half Barry John, who died in February 2024. For some, age and injuries were determining. For others, like the loose forward John Taylor, politics was paramount. Taylor didn't like the idea of touring a country in the grip of apartheid, and he said so. There were suspicions that others didn't like the idea of consorting with apartheid either, players like the Welshman Gerald Davies, although they weren't prepared to say so and simply made themselves unavailable. So while the side 3 years later wasn't entirely different, it also was not entirely the same. This necessitated the forging of team spirit, along with an almost violent insistence on scrummaging at the Strathvaal Rugby Club. Handing out red jerseys, which contributed to the feeling that Irishmen and Scots were now Lions, was vital because it made them feel special and different. The jersey ritual brought together 30 players, 2 full teams, into what was a rapidly unifying whole after their first week of intense training. The squad of 30 Lions contained 9 Welshmen, 8 Englishmen, 7 Irishmen, and 6 Scots, amongst them the merrily destructive Scots lock Gordon Brown, who would go on to be the scorer of 8 tour tries. Brown had received, quote, a mass of letters from anti-apartheid demonstrators prior to his departure. Quote, I read every single one of them. I respected their viewpoint, but every one of them went in the bin, he said. I wanted to go to South Africa. I wanted to see for myself. In a narrow sense, Brown made the correct decision to tour. Others did too. Take the Welshman Gareth Edwards, all-round chirpy extrovert, snappy dresser, and the world's best scrum half, or Phil Bennett, Edwards' halfback partner, who replaced Barry John, who had been a standout in New Zealand in 1971. Bennett looked frail. He was milk white, with legs as thin as a society stick. Despite his apparent frailty, he was a rugby wizard, a man who could see possibility in the most hopeless of situations. J.J. Williams on the wing was a Commonwealth Games sprinter, and next to him, well, that was J.P.R. Williams, he of the mutton chop whiskers, white headband, and socks around his ankles. J.P.R. was a rugby genius and spent most of the tour straining at the leash of customary decency by spoiling for a fight. They were a powerful, talented, and combustible combination. Great scrummagers, canny loosies, quicksilver backs. McBride had only to keep them from going off the rails, with Miller providing the odd technical tweak. Other than that, they occasionally needed to be reminded that the Lions hadn't won a series in South Africa since 1896. It was more than enough to keep them boiling. And there was one other thing. The tour to South Africa was McBride's 5th Lions tour and his 3rd to the country. McBride was 33 when he arrived in South Africa and turned 34 on the 6th of June, 2 days before the first test in Cape Town. He didn't know for sure, but he guessed that this was going to be his last Lions tour. He wanted to make it count. Making it count meant being brutal when required. To this end, the Lions pioneered the famous 99 call as a means to deal with opposition thuggery. Referees in those days were generally reluctant to send players off. The Lions realized this. They also realized that if the entire team went apeshit, it guaranteed their protection because it would be difficult for a ref to identify one player in the fracas. In some of the tests, it became what TV commentator Nigel Starmer-Smith called, quote, a giant free-for-all, more fitting for the boxing ring. One thing was for certain, McBride and his pride in 1974 weren't going to die wondering. Forgive me while I interrupt the sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Television only arrived in South Africa 2 years later, in 1976, so there was no trial by TV and no TV replays. If you all got stuck in, the referee and his linesman would be unlikely to get stuck into you. Looking back on it, there's a kind of brilliant, if dastardly, pragmatism to an entire team getting involved in a brawl. Unlike other Lions teams, who were talented if happy-go-lucky, McBride and Miller's team were prepared down to the last detail. Such thoughtfulness served them well. They were also well served by the fact that South African rugby was in a period of thumb-twiddling introspection. Domestic rugby in South Africa regressed in the early 1970s, something the Lions would demonstrate with brutal efficiency. The Boks were walking backwards into the past, dew-eyed as they celebrated past victories. The Lions, by contrast, were romping into the future. After dispensing with the Western Transvaal Millieboere, as they were then widely known in their opening match, the Lions received a minor scare at the hands of Jan Ellis's Southwest Africa, the Lions eventually winning 23-16. In the Lions' third match, they flattened Boland like a runaway steamroller. Their fourth match was against Eastern Province, a provincial team who had a well-developed reputation for thuggery. The press started talking it up as rugby's equivalent of a Boer War skirmish, the Daily Mail's Terry O'Connor making that very comparison, much to the disgust of Doc Craven, South African rugby's then supremo. The match at the Boet Erasmus Stadium in Port Elizabeth, as it then was, simmered nicely through the first half, only really coming to life shortly into the second, when it deteriorated into a pitched battle. You can see it all on YouTube, if you care for such things. Referee Fonnie van der Vyver seemed reluctant to take stern action. How could he, cynics might ask? The fireworks were too widespread. And, after scoring 3 tries, in those days a try was worth 4 points, Province's resistance wilted. The Lions, with Brown and Slattery prominent, gave as good as they got. In the end, they ran out 28-14 winners. The Eastern Province captain that day was Hannes Moreer, widely, if sentimentally, known in Afrikaans-speaking South Africa as Onse Hannes. Earlier in the year, the rector of the University of Port Elizabeth, where Moreer worked, received a clandestine visit from Professor Johan Claassen, the Springbok coach. He was there to ask if Moreer could be temporarily relieved of his academic duties to lead his country. The rector agreed, and the slightly reluctant 33-year-old was pressed into service. He regained his fitness by running on the beachfront, occasionally bending down to lift whitewashed stones above his head. The press were already whetting their appetite ahead of Moreer's front-row engagement with the pugnacious Scot, Mighty Mouse McLaughlin. Some canny observers wondered if perhaps Moreer's recall wasn't symptomatic of endemic indecision within Bok's selection ranks. It was difficult to say for sure. The Lions, meanwhile, ran in 16 tries against Southwestern Districts in Mossel Bay to gallop to a 97-0 win. Dubbed a fiasco in sections of the Afrikaans press, the mismatch was quickly forgotten as fans looked forward to the game against Western Province at Newlands, 3 days later. Despite the open-air boxing match at Boet Erasmus, the Western Province contest was being read as a kind of key indicator to South Africa's chances in the 4 tests. The first test was played a week later, also at Newlands, and the rugby-loving public felt sure that if Province, with barnstorming loose forwards like Morne du Plessis, Dougald MacDonald and Boland Coetzee in their midst, could give a good account of themselves, it would bode well for the Springboks' chances. Such blithe optimism was shattered early, after Western Province's first put-in, in fact. Taking place in the shadow of the main grandstand, Roy McCullum, the Western Province scrum half, fed the ball in, but no sooner had the ball disappeared from his hands than the Province pack were forced backwards. It was a merciless display of power scrummaging from the visiting Lions. The heel against the head resulted in clumsy ball, which Bennett heaved onto the Province full back. Province regrouped, but the clearing of their lines was so frantic that Johan Oosthuizen's kick sheared off the side of his boot straight into Clive Rees's hands. He had only to catch safely and sprint over the Western Province line from close to score the try for the Lions. Province were not uncompetitive in the match. The try count was shared at 2 apiece, but from the vantage point of the present, it is fascinating to see the way in which the reporters, and to a lesser extent the general public, were seduced by Province's rangy, open-ended rugby. The fact that the Lions' scrummaging work in Stilfontein was coming to fruition was quietly forgotten in a mind-numbing act of collective denial. Instead, the white nation looked forward to the first test, breathing a very South African compound of hope, ignorance and willed self-delusion, while many black South Africans were eagerly waiting for their white oppressors to receive their comeuppance. On the morning of the first test, the Springboks drove down the peninsula from the Arthur's Seat Hotel in Sea Point and had tea at the Kalk Bay Hotel. Conversation naturally turned to the weather. Coetzee, a farmer in the Boland, was of the belief that the wind would die down, and so Marais played with it in the first half. The prediction proved perilously wrong. The goalpost continued to sway throughout the afternoon. For the Lions, Bennett sailed 3 penalties through them, while Edwards levered over a drop kick. Davie Snyman scored South Africa's only points through a penalty. Having been looked forward to for months, the test was over almost before you could aim your Kodak Instamatic at the tunnel. The Boks were shunted in the scrums, and Slattery made an incredible nuisance of himself by harrying the Bok halfback pair of McCullum and Snyman all afternoon. At the end of a muddy, frustrating and, in several senses, unsatisfactory afternoon, the Lions sprinted from the field, having burgled a 12-3 victory. They were now beginning to grow into their red jerseys, handed out before their first match of the tour against Western Transvaal in Potchefstroom. The mood in the Springbok dressing room after the Newlands defeat was sombre. Klaasen was in no mood for equivocation. Quote, "Our problem lies with the tight 5, he told reporters, an analysis which came as no surprise to Miller and McBride. Quote, "The question that we have to answer," said Klaasen, "is whether there are better players out there that we can use." In truth, the Springbok selectors weren't sure, given that the Boks only had limited international experience up until that stage. The selectors made 6 changes and 1 positional switch for the second test at Loftus Versfeld, the most bizarre of which was dropping Ian McCullum and Davie Snyman for Paul Bayfill and Gerald Bosch as the new halfback pairing. Still, the penny would not drop for the press. Neither did it drop for anyone but the most unsentimental-like members of the public. While it wasn't branded a fluke, it was felt that conditions at Newlands had played into the Lions' hands. The Boks would regroup for Loftus, the Lions would struggle on the hard fields of the Highveld, and the natural order would be restored. Just you wait and see. Even so, the Boks' brains trust were taking no chances. They trained at Bafianspoort Correctional Services, gathering a day before they ordinarily would. The atmosphere in the camp in the days preceding the test was funereal. The players were prevented from reading the newspapers and talking to the media, as they were cocooned in a kind of prison. Du Plessis, who some thought was lucky to be retained, remembers the silence in the team bus on the way to the ground at Saturday lunchtime. Everyone was chup still. As the Boks were pulling up to the back of the stadium, Du Plessis remembers turning to see the Lions in their bus, singing Flower of Scotland at full tilt. They waited until their song had come to an end and then trooped into the changing rooms. Du Plessis was overcome with the feeling that there had to be more joy to representing your country. The Lions' camaraderie and sense of manifest destiny inspired them to 5 tries as the Boks self-destructed in the second test at Loftus, the very place where it had been widely, if complacently accepted, that the wrongs of Newlands would be righted. It was one of the most shambolic displays in the history of South African rugby, with the forwards out-muscled and the backs out-thought and out-sprinted. JPR wrote later in his autobiography that he'd never forget the pall of gloom that covered Loftus in the latter stages of the test, a feeling of complete and utter desolation. A further 10 changes for the defining third test at Boet Erasmus followed, the most absurd amongst them being Gerry Sonnekus's move from 8th man to scrum half. The Boks were pulverized 26-9, a marginal improvement on their 28-9 defeat at Loftus. Johan de Bruin, the Orange Free State lock, chosen for the test because of his Bakkies Botha-like tendencies, returned to Bloemfontein with stories of how you didn't want to hit a ruck because you'd leave more quickly than you'd arrived. It was brutal beyond description, with the Lions in a rare case of being able to intimidate the Springboks physically. Afterwards, with the test series safely in the bag, the final and 4th test was drawn 13-all. A shoulder-high McBride saluted the dirt trackers in his team watching in the stands. This was the last of his 5 Lions tours and undoubtedly his finest hour. He had asked them to rally behind him with protesters outside the hotel doors at their pre-departure hotel in London. He had sung with them, drunk with them, led them. Later that night he would save them when they set alight curtains in the team room in Port Elizabeth and the hotel manager threatened to call the police. Roused by the fiery Welsh hooker, Bobby Windsor, the amiable McBride came to the door in his underpants and pulled on his pipe. Quote, "How many of the police do you think there will be?" McBride asked the distraught hotel manager as the party continued around them and well into the night. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.